So it's my great pleasure to introduce our own Kevan Joe as the next speaker for this session. He'll be sharing his experience on centering Dine epistemology in teaching linguistics. Kevan, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Wilson. I will start. So this is messy. Let's see. Okay. So she Kevan Joe Yenishia, Twinin as Dizinasha, Ado Net Nishlinigi, just Ahni Ani Nishling. Now Kaidina Bashish Chin Ashin had the Dashiche Nasht Ejitrabahan Dashinella, Akut Ego A the Nenishling, University of Arizona Disad Nashkagi by Inishka. Hey everyone, welcome to SAIL 2021. I wanted to kind of start this presentation with introducing you guys to myself and my positionality. The Navajo I said to you guys earlier was my kinship, it is my embodied or lived stories that teach me or us, the Navajo, how we are born, grow, develop, and it is the basis for what kind of individual we develop into. This is a form of self-identification in spoken greetings. And this kind of gives and outlines my positionality. For example, I have 4 clans. The first 2 clans identify my parentage, and it is through these clans that I've actually that kind of lays the groundwork for this project that I've been doing, or this research project that I'm working on. For example, my first clan is translated into English as near the mountain towering house. And it took me a while to realize that this clan is actually a hybrid clan of 2 distinct people that were once separate before the colonization of the Navajo at Fort Sumner, Huelte, or the Long Walk. For example, just Ahni means near the mountain, and it refers to the White Mountain Apache, who are also gathered and put into these concentration camps with the Navajo. And Kia'ani is the Towering House people, or the Towering House clan. So my 2 clans embody a history of colonization, and it kind of informs, it's kind of informing my approach to teaching linguistics in this context. My second clan is also a mixed clan, although it comes from a longer history. Nakainenea is the word for Mexican people, and it refers to the colonization of the Spanish people who came through the American Southwest. And in stories, they tell of the Spaniards who brought with them an indigenous person from Central America who was later freed from captivity and adopted into the Navajo people. And she became the first mother of this clan. So that is kind of my parentage, and I'll get into more detail about how this is important. And I'll lastly end on my grandparentage. So my grandparentage kind of identifies my great-grandparents. And it is here that I kind of wanted to focus on the fact that a lot of my my grandparents experienced the aftermath of Huelte, where a lot of this experiences can be surmised in colonial schooling. My family is originally from a place called Twin Mesa. The closest mission school that was set up there was called Navajo Gospel Mission, and apparently my grandma is in the bottom picture with the row of students. We don't actually know which one she is, who she is, but this kind of sets up the positionality of where I am approaching the study from. And the context that this study is centered on has been this context of decolonization. Using the definitions from Waiziatamwin and Yellowbird, they describe colonization as both the formal and informal methods, the behavior, the ideology, the institutional, political, and economical that maintain the subjugation and or exploitation of indigenous peoples, land, and resources. It is a process that is achieved through invasion and conquest. In order to kind of combat colonialization practices, we have to journey through decolonization practices. Decolonization is the meaningful and active resistance to the forces of colonization, colonialism, and perpetuate the subjugation and or exploitation of our minds, bodies, and lands. Decolonization is engaged for the ultimate purpose of overturning the colonial structure and realizing indigenous liberation. It is the meaningful and active resistance to the forces of colonization. I put my study around this context because it is important for understanding the colonization of the disciplines. This terminology comes from Smith's book on decolonizing methodologies. She states that for many indigenous people, the major agency for imposing this positional superiority over knowledge, language, and culture was colonial education. Colonial education was enacted either through missionary or religious schooling, often residential schools, and it preceded public and later secular schooling. This school knowledge systems were informed and linked to universities, scholarly societies, and imperial views of culture. The emergence of the concept and study of the other, as we are sometimes described as, was found and studied through the exploration, exploitation, and appropriation of the concept of the way for ethnographic gaze or third eye and spectacle. We are often referred to in these types of terms. And although colonial universities saw themselves as being part of an international community, the inheritors of a legacy, they were actually the inheritors of a legacy of Western knowledge. Institutions themselves, they are also part of the historical processes of imperialism. They were established as an essential part of the colonizing process, a bastion of civilization, and a sign that a colony and its settlers had, quote unquote, grown up. A lot of this is centered around having a theory of race in Western eyes. Part of Western schooling contributed to further colonization of the mind and enforced the continued exclusion, marginalization, and denial of indigenous knowledges, languages, and cultures. This form of education was used as a mechanism for creating new indigenous elites. Drawing from my own personal experience, a language assessment done by Lee in 2007 and in 2009, as well as a language assessment done by Shepard in 2012, showed that students, children, adolescents, and college-age students revealed a desire to learn more about the complexities of grammar delivered in a medium that fits into a Western model of education. So this comes from studies done on the communities on the Navajo Reservation. Today, the ways in which indigenous languages are represented in the field of linguistics, capital L, reflects logic of Western imperialism and appropriation of the other. So we have knowledge of the other in the Western context was there to be discovered, extracted, appropriated, and distributed. This recentering and privileging reaffirmed the West's view of itself as the center of legitimate knowledge. These ideas are then taught and implemented in forms of colonial schooling and education that also have their own brutal colonial histories that enforce the continued exclusion. And Smith offers kind of this interesting view on colonialism and modern Native intellectuals. Smith says that Native intellectuals who have been trained in the West contribute greatly to nationalistic movements. However, this group is the closest in line with colonizer ways of thinking, values about the world, and conducting research. Part of mediating or addressing this in the current generation of academics is what she refers to as journeying back over the line. The first phase of this journey is stating that we have to prove that intellectuals have been assimilated into the culture of the occupying power. The second phase is a period of disturbance and the need for the remembering of who you are and reflecting on the past. And the third phase is to seek to reawaken the people and realign themselves to produce revolutionary and national literature. The paintings on the left or on the right are from Amber Dubois Shepherd. I think these images are a great example of meeting colonization and bringing it into new perspectives, where we're living in a world with this colonial past. And part of mediating that is to kind of accept this and grow from it. These paintings depict talking God. The first image on the top is titled Morning Talk and Coffee with Che. Che is our word for your maternal grandfather. And this is him in spirit form talking with you. The bottom image is titled Shemasan is said to let the sheep out. And it shows a Navajo kid herding the sheep with talking God beside him. Part of decolonizing the field of linguistics as a whole includes not only documentary work on all forms of language, but also involves decolonizing previously held ideas about knowledge and language. Dylan Robinson, in his 2020 book, Hungry Listening, he asks the question, how might we need to reorient our practices of listening? First, by recognizing that all of us have adapted settler colonial forms of perception, or tin ears that disallow us from understanding indigenous song as both an aesthetic and more than. I turn to Robinson's analysis of perception of sound, mainly because many of us have realized as indigenous people, we know how much our songs and stories carry much of the political discourse we need in, what would be considered Western forms of court. Robinson uses this example of a court case called the Law versus Ayuk versus Written versus Oral History. It talks about a judge who in a court of law would not accept the testament of an elder because the elder requested that her testament be sung in song. And the ruling from the judge was that he couldn't accept this song as a legitimate legal source because he had tin ears, and it was going to be hard for him to understand why song is important in native political discourse. So all of this is kind of backgrounded and is giving you the context for this project proposal or my research design, my main research topic. My main research topic is looking at teaching linguistics requires a critical approach to language endangerment and language teaching. Documentation of indigenous languages have been and are recorded from settler colonial forms of knowledge and practice. In order to decolonize the field of linguistic study, I centered in indigenous knowledge and epistemology as a theoretical framework for teaching colonial forms of linguistic concepts, description, and documentation. are Dine teachings, indigenous theory principles that provide a structure for decolonizing Western perceptions of language and even research. The kind of makeup of this epistemology can be broken down into an ontology, methodology, and an axiology. The ontology, or the nature of reality in the Navajo worldview, is drawn from the four directions, the four sacred mountains, important mental concepts, the people around you, and the cycle of life. From this ontology, the Navajo, it has a individualized methodology or purpose or process. This is maintaining hojon through prayer, song, dance, ceremony, symbol, and sand paintings. Hojon itself describes the normal state of the fourth world, which is the state of beauty, harmony, health, happiness, and peace. And it is not permanent. It can be and is often disrupted. This methodology is then informed and practiced with an axiology or values and ethics important to the Navajo culture and worldview. It is a multi-layered component that interacts with physically, emotionally, intellectual, and spiritually components that are common to a lot of indigenous worldviews. Speaking more on the methodology, maintaining Hojon is actually maintained in this research paradigm, or this Navajo research paradigm. So the Navajo word "aschinsala" is it's a definition, or it's the description of methodology in the Western sense. But this is considered duality in the Navajo worldview. So the methodology is enacted in practice through the principles of male and female, night and day, negative and positive, and other interdependent, interrelated, and interlinked elements, where often conflict and harmony coexist, which also considers that for action there is a reaction, and which is contained within the unique term of Sa Nave Hojon. So one of the questions that I had was, how can this epistemology greater inform teaching linguistics? If you guys don't know, I am a graduate student who is teaching an introduction to linguistics to undergraduate students. So part of my responsibility of being a linguist, an insider linguist, was also teaching the students in my class important cultural worldviews about how language study in the Navajo worldview is done and conducted. So I shared with them a piece of the Navajo creation story that goes over the birth of language and the birth of linguistics itself, drawing from these narratives, these songs and these stories about how language was born into the world. I use three main sources. The first source is Biguet, by Berlinda Biguet. It is a dissertation that focuses on learning Navajo with stories and principles simultaneously, mainly for developing curriculum. And a lot of the stories that are documented in this dissertation are stories from Dr. Wilson Aronowitz that were taught to him by his grandmother. Interesting connection. My aunt, who attended Dine College, also took introduction to Navajo courses from Dr. Wilson Aronowitz. So there's some legacy there. The other resources I looked at are Irving Morris, who has a book on the retelling of the emergence narrative after returning from Fort Sumner, and Gary Witherspoon's articles on the ethnographic and anthropological description of the Navajo worldview are important in this as well. I feel like I'm running out of time, but quickly go over the story that I've told not only my students, but other people in the department who have sat through this presentation before. In the beginning, there was darkness. This is the first world in Navajo epistemology. From the darkness, a black cloud emerged. This was Nithitoshith, or black world. From this cloud emerged a light, and from this light, it reached out and touched everything in the universe. And when it did, it created Sa Nare, or thought. Sa Nare then transformed and became sound and prayer. Sa Nare, in the form of sound and prayer, then transformed itself and became Bik-el-Hojon, or feeling and speech. Bik-el-Hojon, embodying feeling and speech, then transformed and became song. In the Navajo worldview, Sa Nare and Bik-el-Hojon are the central animating powers of the universe and all living beings, including the earth, the sacred mountains, and so on. They all have inner Sa Nare and outer Bik-el-Hojon forms, which must harmonize and unify. Even though Sa Nare and Bik-el-Hojon are considered one entity, they also transformed themselves and became the first corporeal being, Hashtefte, or talking god, whose ceremonial mask is worn during the winter dances that reenact the the story and recreation of the Navajo world. Talking God, Hasheft, is the physical embodiment of Sa Na Re, even though he is born from both Sa Na Re and Bik'ah Khojan. Talking God in the form of thought, sound, and prayer again then transformed itself into Hashchechran, house God, whose ceremonial mask is worn by both male and female Yebiche dancers during the winter dances. Hashchechran, house God, is also considered the physical embodiment of Bik'ah Khojan, even though it is born from talking God in the form of thought, sound, and prayer. Furthermore, Hashchechran in the Navajo creation story, armed with the sacred rainbow, then placed it into first man's mouth. This created our tongues, and is why our tongues are shaped in a bow. Hashchechran, gifted with sacred corn, and white shell, then placed it into first man's mouth and created our teeth and our hard palates. This is referred to in English as Sa Na Re Bik'ah Khojan Sad, often incorrectly translated as the language of life. According to Begay, our language was created to communicate with the holy people and spirit world, as well as to put us into relationship with all of creation. The languages stem from the land and help us remember we are a part of it. The reason there are so many different indigenous languages in North and South America is because of the diversity of landscape. When the landscape changes significantly, a new indigenous language appears. Thus, language is a form of cultural expression that transmits information about the identity as Nuk'ah, the Earth surface people. Our language is a form of cultural expression that it consists of and carries cultural information that goes beyond the explicit meaning of words. It is the languages that brought our world into life. The essence of our language was created for one purpose, Sodazin, prayer and song. Begay concludes that it was from the first deity, Ya'asnani Yana, that created language in the form of Sa Na Re and Bik'ah Khojan. It was through Hashchechran that breathed the language into all of creation. And for this reason, we say our language is the holy people's language, Diyin Dina'ah Bizad. And when the holy people breathed their language into the Dina'ah, it became Dina'ah Bizad, often referred to as our form of linguistic study and practice. This methodology is also represented in two types of ceremonies. The Nalre, the protection way ceremonies, which are male teachings, and the Hojonje ceremonies, or the beauty or blessing way ceremonies. These are feminine teachings that are reenacted every winter during the retelling of these stories. So duality represents balance. Everything that is alive in the universe is born from this duality. And I'll kind of begin to end on Witherspoon's idea of how the world was transformed from knowledge and organized in thought. In the Navajo worldview, this was patterned in language and realized in speech. Speech is a symbolic action. In the Navajo view of the world, language is not a mirror of reality. Reality is a mirror of language. Knowledge is an awareness of a symbol. Thought is the organization of the symbol, and symbol is word. And word is the means by which substance is organized and transformed. So a question evolves of how to implement this story or this epistemology in the classroom. One way that I've kind of wrestled with this is by teaching linguistics as the awareness of symbol to linguistics to further educate people on the study of the linguistic concepts, like what is a word? For example, if you are learning a foreign language, you might learn a word from a book, know what it means, but not know how to pronounce it. Or you might hear a word, pronounce it perfectly, but not know what it means. Then again, you might know the pronunciation and meaning of, say, a noun, but not know how it is plural is formed or what its genitive case looks like. In this sense, knowing a word unites different kinds of knowledge, and this is just as true of your knowledge of how to construct phrases and sentences. This is a piece that I showed with my students. This is from my lecture slides. What makes a word rather than just random noise is that it is uttered intentionally in order to express some idea or concept. Words used by skilled speakers can combine with other elements of linguistic form to create, express complex ideas. Can either aid the formation of ideas or constrain concepts that can be entertained. Language, however, is distinct from the ideas that might be expressed. Starting from this idea, I can then be able to help my students learn more about linguistics by asking them what a speech sound is. Speech sounds, according to some linguistic articles that I found, is intentional utterances that can be described as sequences of individual speech sounds, also called segments or phonemes, represented by phonetic symbols. Segments can refer to individual sounds that make syllables and appear as either consonants or vowels. And these strings of segments are arranged in a sequence unique to individuals' languages' sounds. This image up here is a heat map of 1,672 languages and the occurrence of the most found sounds in languages, and includes click sounds. In the Navajo worldview, language was placed in our mouths through the sacred rainbow. And in the Navajo worldview, the rainbow yeti is in a lot of sand paintings, and it also encompasses our tribal flag. To me, language is a rainbow, and I feel like by approaching it from this type of worldview, you can begin to see even greater patterns that exist in languages all over the world. I will end kind of sort of on this quote by Hinton. Endangered languages, as they lose speakers, lose also much of the knowledge that the traditional culture has accumulated. Stories, songs, histories, prayers, ceremonies, and traditional crafts and practices are all in danger of dying with the languages, and the unique and wonderful words, sounds, semantics, grammatical structure, and discourse patterns of the languages die too. Hinton talked passionately also about vocables in languages. Songs are rich in vocables, which are fragments or parts of syllables that are found in a lot of different song traditions across the Americas. These are from Hinton's works about how round dance songs have lines of 15 syllables that are not meaningless, but meaningful segments of speech that are intentionally uttered to give you greater context to what type of song is being sung. These songs have their own types of genres, and have many reasons for being. In some cases, vocables derive from real words. I was a little fast on that, but I'll end it kind of on this idea of how this presentation can further greater inform linguistic research. So part of my research from doing teaching linguistics from this epistemological framework has raised more issues, I feel like, or more places of study for myself. For example, what is the role of language and the image and how we view images? What is the role of language and sound and how our perceptions of sound are changed and altered? What is language's connection to history? What is its connection to trauma, revitalization, and acquisition? These are kind of further research questions that I have for myself, based off this. And it is my hope that drawing from these teachings, the linguistic definition of syllables, words, songs, and phonetics, or any type of linguistic concept, can be redefined and contextualized to fit into various indigenous worldviews that not only rely on linguistic analysis, description, but is supported by a cultural worldview that is inherently missing or lacking the sacred connection language carries. And I believe that is all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevan. That's a great. So here's the thing. We we are on the break time, but since we're online, I really don't have a problem if we just go continue with a Q&A.
Okay.
Until the plenary by Darren McKinney. So the floor is open for whoever wants ask a question.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Any questions or answers? I do invite. Let's see. What is it? I do invite questions about from anthropology about the view of imagery. I have a lot of imageries in this presentation, and I would like some, advice about how the image can be better improved in this presentation.
Jay Hinkler, it was just a comment. Penelope, did you have a question? I'm looking at the chat.
It looks like Connor's hand is up.
Oh, okay. Connor.
This is just wonderful, really lovely. One of the things that comes to mind is that whenever I've talked to people about linguistics, I've made an effort to point out to them that even though the linguistics that we get taught now is what it is, that linguistics is not a European science in origin. It's been Europeanized, and that's a lot of what we're dealing with. But it's, Europeans didn't have linguistics; they basically got it from India. And I think that the one thing I wanted to mention about that is sort of a nice tie-in, is that as far as we can tell from the stories that Indian people tell about their own linguistics, is that it emerged as an effort to connect with the sacredness of language, that the language that they were using in the Rig Veda was so sacred to them that they basically invented linguistics as a way to get closer to that, get better at that, and maintain that. So that it's sort of, when you bring this in, it's kind of returning it's kind of calling linguistics back to the origins of even the European one, which comes from the Indian one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great, yeah, it's been an interesting journey. I've never really researched epistemologies before this semester, so it was really interesting seeing how teaching linguistics itself, with indigenous values, has kind of shaped my research in an interesting way about how to teach it with indigenous values at the front, right? Because a lot of us, I know a lot of us in linguistics describe how linguistics itself is removed from the people. Like, a lot of linguistic stuff are treated as objects, stuff you're supposed to distance yourself and interact with impersonally. But that is just a direct violation of how we all understand language, right? It is a part of us, and you can't get rid of that perspective.
Any other comment or questions?
I have a question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, Kevin. Good to
Hello.
see you. Hi. This was fantastic. That's just it, right? This just rocked. But what I'm wondering is, what advice could you give, or how could someone who is not Dine incorporate this perspective in the linguistics course to encourage their students to think more broadly about the origins and purposes of linguistics and other non-Western epistemologies?
Right, yeah, so this is something I've kind of been thinking about, and it kind of relates back to this further research slide, I found that even though in the Navajo worldview, our creation story kind of gives us the birth of the field of linguistics itself in the modern Western notion, I think a lot of other indigenous languages aren't like that. Origin stories are unique to them. And it kind of just makes me think of like language can also be stored in sound, so I don't know if any other indigenous languages out there have an origin story about how language and sound emerged, or how language and image emerged together. So it requires looking at the cultural history through language of a people to see how language emerged and what language emerged along with, right? Sometimes it can be traumatic. Sometimes it can explain greater linguistic phenomena, right? So I think the Navajo one is unique, but I also think there are even uniquer ones that will better inform our understanding of language itself.
So if a non-native linguist wanted to include more perspectives and epistemologies in the class, but didn't feel comfortable telling this story because it's not their story to tell, how would you recommend they go about including these perspectives and this story, because it's such a beautiful story?
Right. I've actually, through teaching, I've kind of come across this several times by, trying to give representation to smaller tribes. So one way I've kind of taught the kind of history of the vocable is by also teaching the history of the ghost dance and the tragedy that happened. So, for a non-Indigenous scholar, I think, who really wants to pay homage to these language, I think it's imperative for them to also know the trauma and the social historical brutality that happened. And by kind of going through that and expressing language through that, I think it gives you a better appreciation and a better understanding of our own perspectives, regardless of tribe. But that's not the end all be all. There might be some criticism against that, which is fine. But it is also a question that I think Indigenous people, we have to kind of look within our own tribes and our own knowledge systems to kind of better address that. Right.
Any other question? I saw a question. I saw passing here. Someone asked when your book's coming out. Who asked the question? Yeah.
I posed that question because it went literature piece for all Indigenous education scholars. Like, I really enjoyed this presentation, and I'm currently attending University of Victoria as a doctorate student, and this was totally in an alignment and parallel to what we're studying, and I've never seen it explained and expressed so eloquently. And also the synthesis of your presentation was just elite. I was quite impressed, and I'd like to see this published, definitely, with your name all over it.
I am working on getting this published. This is kind of, the culmination of work that I actually started at the beginning of the semester. Looking at the epistemologies of Navajo language was insightful, and I think it's given me back this passion I have for not only linguistics, but also for language revitalization as a field of study. I'm in the U of A linguistics department in the language revitalization, documentation, and preservation track. And this story and this research just kind of reinvigorated my passion for that study. And I'm incredibly humbled to be sharing it with you all, because I feel like many of us are still dealing with trauma, especially in trauma in education, and none of that has been remediated. Hojan has been disrupted. And we are still trying to find ways to restore that hojon, that beauty, that peace.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Christian, do you have a question? Christian Huvalkaba?
Yeah, sorry, I had to unmute everything. I'm wondering if, since you mentioned you'd been incorporating this into intro or your linguistics courses, and I was wondering what some of the reactions or responses from your students had been. Would have been wonderful to have a class like this as an intro linguistics student.
It's been interesting. It's kind of unfortunate, but the course that I'm teaching is actually entirely online, which would be an entirely interesting, different research project about how teaching linguistics from an Indigenous point of view works online. I haven't even begun to dissect that, but it would be interesting to kind of do a little paper on how that happened. But I've kind of interacted with my students through these discussion posts, kind of inspired by Liz. I was actually a TA for Liz a while ago, and she had this really good online discussion rubric that encouraged students to actually discuss these linguistic topics. So I have them do that, and reading through them has just been so heartwarming. Because a lot of the students are actually taking the class not as a linguistic course, but as kind of an elective to fulfill their undergraduate course requirements. And a lot of them have no prior experience with linguistics, no prior experience to Indigenous languages, and no prior experience to polysynthetic languages, because Navajo is a polysynthetic language. So part of my research goals for the class is having my students research a polysynthetic language. And that kind of has also influenced my entire teaching class. Centering polysynthetic languages as the main research study has really kind of rearranged how I think about syntax, phonology, and all of these other aspects of linguistics. And my students, I feel like, have been enjoying it because they're also getting a lot of this cultural information as well. And, you know, a greater appreciation of the wide ranges of places that languages touch.
Thank
I can speak.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, Christian, to kind of elaborate just a little more, I have a student. I don't know how he feels about me talking about his work, but he's doing a research study on Kawaisu, or no. It's a dialect of Greenlandic. I don't remember which exact one, but he's talking about the past tense marker and how it is working in like this language. And it's really interesting stuff about what they kind of think about and what they want to study.
We have time for last quick question. Connor, do you still have your hands up?
If there's anybody else, have them go. Was there someone else? If not, I just wanted to draw, when you were asking about the connection between language and image, in the chat I just noted there's this great book that literally talks about, it has this diagram of 3 things, which is language, image, and symbol. And and the entire book is a comic book. So if you get a chance to check it out, it's in the chat. It may be really wonderful to look at. It's by Scott McCloud, called Understanding Comics, but it's all about language, image, and symbol.
Isaiah, do you want to share your? Isaiah also seems to have some similar recommendation. Okay, well, again, thank you so much, Kevan. We're very proud of you, our former NAMA student and now a PhD student. Great work. I also want a copy of that book. So on next